What's going on YouTube? My name is Ben and today we are going to go over a highly requested Athlean X Jeff Cavalier chest pec anatomy video. Jeff has put a lot of really solid content out there. I think that there are some places that we will agree and some places that will disagree, so excited to jump right into this video and hopefully give you all some guidance as to how you can potentially adjust this information to make it a little bit more appropriate to you individually. But yeah, without further ado, let's just jump right into it.
I've actually been practicing here, as you can see. The idea here is if we take the band and we activate the chest by going into this position here, we see that there's a lot of things going on in terms of the fibers and the orientation of the fibers. They're not all running in the same direction. As a matter of fact, they don't even all have the same attachments. The fibers that originate from the upper chest here are coming off of the clavicle, and they're running down towards the humerus. Right, but the most important thing is they're going from a high to low position. Whereas the fibers that come off of the sternum, again, a different bone than the clavicle, are actually coming in more of a horizontal direction, going almost straight across the chest out towards the arm. And then we have the ones that come off of the bottom portion here of the sternum, and they head up. So these are not going completely horizontal. These are actually traveling from a low to a high position.
So I think it's a really good idea to focus primarily, especially when you're learning anatomy, on fiber direction. I think it's a really good place to start, and it's also a really good point to keep in mind as you go through training. I think it's really important to recognize, though, that a lot of information that we understand about muscles comes visually from textbooks, right? That's how most people consume and also create content, and we have to understand that with that there comes a limitation, or rather a discrepancy between actual humans and the way that we study anatomy. So when we look at a textbook, we see a 2D representation of a human, which inherently is three-dimensional, as most of you know. So for the most part, I think it's important to recognize that there is value in just looking at fiber direction, but also to recognize that at the same time, we need to have a little bit more of a nuanced perspective when it comes to fully understanding anatomy, specifically how it interacts with actual motion and physics, because we're not 2D representations, sheets of paper. We're 3D human beings that move around in 3 dimensions of space. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where he takes this. I haven't seen this video, so off to a good start from the perspective of talking about fiber direction, but there are some nuances that are involved in pec-specific anatomy that maybe he'll touch on, maybe he won't.
So we should know, if you've been watching this channel, that in order to fully hit the chest, you're going to want to choose exercises that follow those fibers. Meaning, you're going to want to take your arm through different ranges of motion to better hit and align it with those fibers.
So I think that's a really good point to make, and couldn't agree more. I think it's very valuable to understand fiber direction, generally speaking, and also to follow the idea of following the fibers. All right, so Jeff is just saying with the upper pec, because it runs more low to high, we want to choose motions that are maybe a little bit lower to a little bit higher. Makes sense to me.
So let's see what those would be. Well, we know we got to choose the staple exercises. We know we got to choose the exercises that allow us to load them the most, so the pec gets the most capacity to be overloaded. And that starts.
So I think this is a sort of common mistake that people will make, both in terms of educating other people, but also in terms of just their own thought processes around which exercises they should choose and why. Loading is important in terms of how much weight you're able to use on an exercise, but it's only important insofar as how we're able to actually load a very particular position for a particular goal, right? So a bench press is an exercise that you can physically hold a lot of weight on a barbell with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of that weight is being used primarily by your pec, and it also doesn't mean that the more weight that you add, the bigger your pecs will be. This is a very common mistake for people to make, where they just assume that adding more weight is the goal of growing, but the goal of growing is to grow. And so a lot of times we actually don't need as much weight as we may traditionally think to impose a change or a significant stimulus. And just like I said, I think that a lot of people can be misled by just trying to constantly focus on only the amount of weight that they're lifting. And as we may see with the bench press, that can be problematic for a number of reasons when it comes to pec specifically.
Right here, the bench press. So as I move my arm out in a bench press, the alignment of the arm is moving here almost parallel.
Okay, so super common mistake to make with trying to understand and conceptualize pec anatomy is that the arm, as you can see, like Jeff kind of has his arm a little bit wider here. And even if we just are looking at this from one perspective, this 2D sort of lacking context perspective, we can see that the direction of the arm is actually perfectly aligned with pretty much where his delt is, right? His front delt or anterior delt. And it's actually, to a degree, if you can picture what all these pec fibers are doing, they're coming up from what looks to be a straight line here, but then they also sort of wrap up and around the bone in this sort of like a, and I'll put an image up on the screen here, but they actually sort of do this twisting thing where they come toward the outside of the bone. And when the arm is up and out to the side a little bit wider, the pecs actually lose leverage in their ability to actually pull the arm forward and across the body. Where they gain the most amount of leverage in terms of their insertion on the bone is actually when the arm is a little bit tighter to the body because they stretch around the ribs. This is kind of why I was touching on the whole 2D, 3D thing earlier, where with the pec specifically, because it sits on top of the rib cage, it stretches around and contracts around the rib cage, much like any sort of pulley that you see at the gym, right, where the pulley is sort of wrapping around the circle. You can think about the rib cage as what's called an anatomical pulley, where the rib cage is basically the surface on top of which the pecs can stretch. But for the pecs to be able to utilize that mechanism, the arm needs to be tighter to the body, tighter to the ribs, and not super wide out in this position that Jeff has here. So again, this is why the 2D, 3D thing is really, really important to consider, because in actual human motion, we're dealing with 3 dimensions, 3 different primary planes. We're not just looking at things from, again, that 2D picture.
To these mid fibers coming off of the middle portion here of the sternum, and that's what happens here, as you see on the exercise itself, to hit the middle portion of the chest. It's a good developer of that portion of the chest.
So I'm not going to disagree that the bench press has a very high capacity, especially in beginner intermediate individuals from a hypertrophy context, to be able to create hypertrophy or increase size and strength of the chest. But when we're looking at any exercise from the perspective of how valuable is it compared to others, we need to start to create a little bit of a value system or a hierarchy of exercises where we look at it not just in the context of itself, but also in the context of every other exercise that we have available to us. So when we look at something like the bench press, more specifically, Jeff mentioned that like the middle fibers will be targeted, especially so with this kind of a flat variation. And I would tend to disagree with that just because of the fact that the bench press, because it is a free weight motion, is loaded most at the very bottom portion of the motion, where actually the lower or costal division of the pec has the most amount of leverage. So typically speaking, especially in a flat press where you are a little bit more arched in your spine, what you're doing is you're actually creating a really, really high degree of stretch in those lower fibers. Obviously, this varies depending on who you are in your structure, and you'll actually decrease tension through the middle fibers. The middle fibers would probably be stretched more on something like a low incline, and I've seen that across many different clients and also in some research, I believe. But yeah, I would call the bench press, specifically because of where it's loaded and how the arms have to travel because of the fixed implement. That ends up being much more of a lower pec exercise as opposed to a mid pec exercise. But this sort of line of thinking comes more so from the idea of like where the arms actually stretch the pecs as opposed to where they may stretch the pecs without much leverage, as Jeff was sort of demonstrating earlier on with the resistance band motions.
It's a good developer of that portion of the chest. Okay, good. So the flat bench press.
And again, I won't say at all that the bench press won't develop your chest. Of course it will to some degree, but if we're trying to be as specific as possible with the anatomy and the nuances of this stuff, we want to think a little bit deeper about these things and how they maybe can be better applied to the individual.
Obviously, we know there's a reason for doing it, but there's also a reason for doing the incline bench press and doing it as well, because that's going to take the arm through a different position. It's going to take it from a low to a high position, right? We go here, we push up. What is that doing? You can see that now it's taking this upper arm and aligning it more in parallel with the fibers going here in this high to low arrangement. You can see that once again play out as I do the exercise. So far, we're 2 for 2. We've got to the big...
So I totally agree with the idea that we want to pick something for the upper pecs that's more low to high. And funny enough, because he has more of a focus in terms of the arm path direction of coming low, he ends up being a little bit tighter to his ribs. So I would say that the dumbbell variation that he was doing from an arm path perspective would actually be more specific to the mid and upper pec than the bench press would. Specifically because, again, he is coming lower and a little bit tighter, where, again, all of the pecs stretch more in that position, but because of the direction of shove or the direction that the person is pushing, you'll get more mid and more upper pec. I love dumbbell bench press variations for training pecs because you have a really, really high ability to adjust your arm path as well as the angle really wherever you want to.
Bigger exercises, we're able to load them up, and now we got to hit the lower portion of the chest. And the lower chest, we've probably heard, is best hit with a dip. Why is that? Again, it's not by accident, it's by anatomy. You take your arm through this position of an extended arm behind your body, and it comes and it travels down. And as it travels down, you go from this high to low position, better allowing you to hit the lower fibers of the chest versus the ones that run parallel and versus the ones that run.
So totally agree on the idea of the dip being more of a lower pec exercise than anything else, just from a leverage-based standpoint. But if you were to actually go back a little earlier in the video and look at the position of his arm relative to his sternum and his rib cage in the bench press, you would see that the angle actually is extremely similar to the dip that Jeff was demonstrating, wherein they actually stretch pretty similarly, like sort of up and back and a little bit wider just because of the constraint of the dip bar. And that's why those end up being pretty similar exercises from a stimulus perspective. You also have to keep in mind that although the dip is pretty loaded at the top still just because of the constraints of how you have to hold yourself up there, at the bottom there's the most amount of resistance from an external torque perspective. And so what we have to keep in mind is that will be more of a lengthened biased or lengthened based exercise because there's more load in that stretched position where the arms are behind the body, much like in the bench press.
Low to high. So this is really what's important here is that you understand that the exercise selection is not random. It's done for a reason to try to take the muscle through its entire range of motion. But there's a very key differentiator of what I just said there. You want to not just take those exercises through their full range of motion. You want to take the muscle through its full range of motion, and that is where we need to differentiate, and that is where we need to jump off from. Because all of these exercises, see if you can tell the limitation on all of them, from the flat bench press to the incline bench press to the dip. They're not crossing midline. And we know that the action of the pec at the shoulder has capability to take this arm, not just through adduction, but across, in horizontal adduction across midline. And all those exercises are limited by the fact that they don't take you even to midline, let alone across it.
So really, really good point here, and totally agree on this. And this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier, just about the idea of these exercises being more loaded in the lengthened position. And what Jeff is getting at here is that there are all these sorts of ranges across the body, specifically for, upper pec, middle pec, and then lower pec that haven't been loaded yet, specifically because of the exercise selection and the physics of those exercises. So really, really good point here that he's making, and couldn't agree more.
So how would you construct a better chest workout? What you'd want to do is you'd want to take those exercises and follow them immediately with a drop set of an exercise that's going to do that. So let's go back to the flat bench press.
So wouldn't necessarily agree that what you have to do is a drop set following these other exercises. You could just completely include them on a different day or even on the same day just as a different exercise. But I guess we'll just sort of wait and see what the application here is.
We go immediately from our flat bench press here to a horizontal cable crossover. Right now, again, people might even say too, there's a lot of fans of the cable crossover saying that it's a better chest activator from EMG studies than what a flat bench press is doing. But guys, if you rely on EMG studies and you wind up saying things like that and don't understand that, though it may have a better percentage of activation, it's still not capable of being loaded to the extent that a barbell bench press is, therefore limiting its ability to be effective. It's if it's the only thing you do. But if you do it in addition to the bench press, you're getting the benefits of everything. So now we take that and we drop right into this horizontal cable crossover, and we can see that we're actually now taking our arm all the way through and crossing midline and getting that complete activation of the chest in that plane of motion. To stop there though, because we can do different planes of motion because the shoulder is a three-dimensional joint. We can hit any angle we want.
So all joints are three-dimensional. I think what Jeff meant to really illustrate there is that it can move in three different separate planes, which is a good point to make. a couple things here in terms of agreement and disagreement. The first thing that I would agree with is that there should be at some point, and if your goals are highly pec specific in terms of developing your pecs, there should be a point throughout the week or throughout the microcycle that you end up training that short position of the muscle, as Jeff is demonstrating, with something that comes across the body and also something that's more lengthened, i.e. something that challenges you in that more stretched position where the arm is behind the body. Where I would disagree in application here is more so just in the fact that, like, I wouldn't pick a bilateral or double arm exercise to do that, because what you end up having to do is what you end up seeing Jeff doing, which is crossing his arms over one another. I don't really think that's a reliable way to standardize or practice an exercise. It ends up sort of becoming, and you can kind of see this in the way that Jeff demonstrates this, where, you know, he kind of is stumbling across himself and trying to, like, manage the different arm paths that he has to coordinate every single rep. I would rather just do it single arm, and not only single arm do you have that ability to just standardize the rep, you're going to the same point, but because you can actually turn a little bit away from your arm and bring your arm around your body, you end up getting not only more range of motion in that stretch position, but also more range of motion in that shortened position. But overall, I think the principles here are fairly good. I just think there's a little bit of application here that I would change my mind on, or that I would disagree with from that perspective. The other thing, and the last thing I'll say, is kind of a repeat of my earlier comments about the whole EMG thing, and specifically in relation to bench press, which is kind of a tangential discussion. Like EMG, there are a lot of good things about EMG. There are a lot of things that limit its capability in terms of like what we should do and how we should apply things in the gym. But from the perspective of the conversation of like, oh, because the bench press can be loaded so much more, therefore it's like we need that exercise that is higher in loading. Again, load is really just something that sort of is like a byproduct of what your abilities are and what exercises you're choosing. So, you know, you could achieve as much, or if not more, hypertrophy from any sort of cable exercise or any sort of dumbbell based exercise as compared to a barbell bench press or even a Smith machine bench press, where you might have more stability and more opportunity to use weight. But what you have to realize is that your ability to use more weight is dependent on a lot more things that are then included with those kinds of exercises. So for instance, in the cable fly, you have a lot more involvement from most of the pec, but in something like a bench press, you have involvement from much more of the delt. You have much more involvement from the triceps. You have a greater ability to actually utilize both hands pressing into the same thing, which creates constraints that you may not have to worry about in that exercise, but that you would in another exercise. So again, a lot of things to be considered when it comes to that, and not just like, oh, this is a one-to-one. These are completely different scenarios. You're comparing a bench press to a chest fly. You shouldn't be comparing weight. You shouldn't even be talking about weight when it comes to the specific exercise. The weight should be the last thing that you consider on the list of things which come after what are the positions that I want to achieve, and how do I want to load this thing relative to those positions as I go through a range. Again, whatever weight you use should just be a byproduct of those other things. They shouldn't be the first consideration that you make in terms of, oh, how should I do this exercise, or which exercises should I pick. A great example of this, and maybe another scenario that makes a little bit more sense, is like, okay, if I could do a barbell curl or a cable curl, I could probably use more weight in the barbell curl, but we wouldn't say that the barbell curl is a better exercise than the cable curl, simply because the number that you're holding is higher, right? That doesn't actually make any sense. What you can lift is what you can lift. The amount of tension that you can produce is the amount of tension that you can produce. It's not necessarily going to change because the muscle is so much more advantaged or so much less advantaged. It's going to change because of a host of different factors, which may have nothing to do specifically with the muscle at all. So I think it's a really, really important point to remember, is that the weight is not king. The weight is the byproduct of all the other things that need to come before it. So don't prioritize the weight, prioritize the position and the loading, and then just say, okay, what weight is appropriate for this particular scenario, and whether it's more or less depends on a lot more than just how much is the tissue being stimulated.
So if we go back, now we do our incline bench press, and when we're done with that, we don't rest. We immediately go back over to the crossover, and we change the orientation so that our arms can go through this low to high arc. And again, we're not going to stop where we would stop on a bench press. On the incline bench press, what we're going to do is we're actually going to take the arm to midline and through midline, and you can see again the degree of contraction and complete contraction we're getting of the chest by doing so. It's a difference maker, guys.
Another thing that I would say is that with this kind of a setup, you're going to want to use like a much more stable setup. If you're on your, I don't know why Jeff is on his knees here, but like sit on a bench, or again, do it single arm and grab something else. There's no reason to just be flailing about like a fish in space when you could have something that's more stable supporting you. It's not that much work to set up a bench or to just do it single arm and have the other arm to maybe stabilize yourself against the machine.
When you actually implement it. And when we go to the dip, the same thing. Our hands are actually fixed on a dip as well. We can't get our hands to come towards midline because the dip station just allows them to stay in one position. But we can take the dip, we can load it up, we can use weights, we can do whatever we want to create overload with that exercise. As soon as we're done, we come back over here, and now we change the orientation of the cables once again to go from high to low.
So again, solid piece of information just in and of itself, but in application, again, I would have something more stable. There's only going to be so much weight you're going to be able to use on this in terms of just the idea that you're probably leaving a lot on the table, not from the perspective of, again, the weight being priority, more so that, yeah, the weight is secondary to the position and the force direction, but at the same time, if you are limited by your ability just to stabilize the motion and to not be pulled back by the cables, then use a bench, grab onto something, make yourself more stable.
And once again, it's not just getting to midline, but it's crossing through midline.
Another thing to recognize with lower pec based stuff, as I've seen Jeff do this a few times, is a lot of people seem to think that the lower pec is like straight down, like it just kind of takes your arm into your pocket or something. If we think about where those fibers attach toward the lower portions of the sternum, as well as those ribs, what we want to think about is not just coming down, but also coming across, right? It's down and across, which usually means that it's a little bit higher up than most people think. Instead of taking the arm somewhere down here, like, again, into the pocket, we want to come a little bit higher, sort of just below the point of the sternum and not, again, straight downward.
To get a complete contraction of the chest, an essential element for a complete chest workout. And again, one extra exercise here, a push-up, one that we do a lot, I'm sure. You don't have to stop with just the push-up because we're being limited once again by the fact that our hands are in contact with the ground and cannot get across our body. So we use the push-up into this banded push-up where I actually can come up and drive one hand across the body to create an adduction across midline, right?
So a big thing to keep in mind is that, and you can kind of see this in the way that Jeff is executing this, is that this is going to be an exercise that's going to be very difficult to stabilize and very difficult to actually make the pec a limiting factor. And you can kind of see, like, if we full screen this and run this back here, there is a high degree of just the entire body shifting across rather than the arm just coming across. The reason that's happening is because he's shifting his entire center of mass over the opposite arm. And if that's something that you're doing, you're not going to be able to actually just stay here and bring your arm across. What you're doing is, instead of loading your arm across in this direction or pushing across in this direction, what you're doing is you're kind of bringing your arm along with the rest of your body. So again, there's a lot more involved there than just the pec taking your arm across the body. Rather than to choose some sort of complicated, really highly skilled motion like that, just stick to the bread and butter of the cable flies. There's no reason to try to get fancy and do that kind of a push-up thing. If you're someone who has limited equipment and you don't have access to cables, you could do just the same thing you do with a cable with a resistance band. And if you don't have a resistance band, you're probably better off just doubling down on the push-up because it is a much more stable option, or something like a barbell or a dumbbell press if you have access to that and you're at home.
Here. But this is how you complete the development of your chest, by including exercises that can be loaded, by including exercises that take the muscle through its full range of motion, and of course applying full range of motion to all of the exercises, even if they are limited in how much complete range of motion they can apply to the muscle itself. That is how you do it, guys. If you're looking for a complete workout that puts this all together, puts the science back in strength, head to athlean.com. As a matter of fact, we don't just train chest, we train like athletes. We try to figure out ways we can incorporate chest training into a more total body explosive application of it so that we move like athletes, function like athletes, and look like athletes. Those are all over at athlean.com. If you found the video helpful, make sure you let me know.
So the whole athlete conversation is a little bit of a tangential topic that I won't touch too much on now, but I think that this notion of like athletic training versus not athletic training needs to kind of go out the window. When we're talking about training muscles, we're talking about training muscles. Obviously, people have different goals in terms of getting bigger, getting stronger, or both. But for the most part, most of the athletes that you'll be working with just need to stick to the basics that most bodybuilders stick to. and then just work on the skill of their sport separately. I'm really not a fan of like trying to bring the sport into the weight room and trying to mimic things that look athletic in the weight room. A lot of times what ends up happening in those cases, you end up just using zero load on all your exercises, which for professional athletes may actually be a good thing because most professional athletes just need to not get hurt. So anyway, in terms of bigger takeaways of the video, I think Jeff overall, in terms of the principles that he's using, in terms of how he's trying to apply this information, really solid and on point. I just think that there are some spotty things with application, mainly just these specific movements that he's choosing, as well as some of the specific functional anatomy of just understanding how the different fibers are actually oriented. Because again, they're not oriented on a flat sheet of paper that goes this way. They're oriented around the ribs in this sort of three-dimensional way, where to stretch the pecs in very slightly differing directions, we stretch sort of narrow and up for the lower pec. We stretch sort of narrow and back for the middle pec. And then we stretch narrow and low for the upper pec. And then from there, we can pick exercises that are tighter to the ribs, like dumbbell presses, like neutral grip bench, like machine converging press. I love machine converging press, like cable converging press. And then all the different cable variations that you can do, where you can set the cable up anywhere, grab onto something else with, a single arm, or maybe just bring a bench support and have the cables pulling behind you. And again, you have a ton of support that way, and you also have a really great ability to achieve a lot of the range of motion and kinds of details that Jeff is referencing here. So a lot of positives to take away from this video, just some minor things that I would tweak and maybe apply to you more specifically. Please leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe and share if you liked it, and I will see you all in the next video.